So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for the Aspiring Hub 2, and that is Professor Dave Wilson, from Cardiff University. And just to give you a bit of background, they've been supporting the National Health Careers Conference in 2017, and Professor Dave Wilson has got a great insight into everything related to getting into university and a lot more. So please do enjoy the session, and I'm sure you'll find it very rewarding. And please do ask lots of questions. I'm going to hand it over to Professor Wilson.
Thanks, Sonny. That's a big build-up. Right. I hope you can all hear me clearly enough, and I hope what I have to say over the next few minutes is useful to you. I usually start by saying, first off, that this is the best time to be applying to medical school, for the simple reason that the number of medical school places has increased significantly in the last 2 or 3 years after Jeremy Hunt's announcement to increase them from 6,000, around 6,000 to 7,500. And that's coincided with a drop in the number of 18 to 21-year-olds, as you can see in the graph on this slide. What we have is these combined factors that make applying to medicine now probably the most attractive proposition that it has been for some years. So I think it's important you bear in mind. The other thing to remember is, of course, that there are two aspects of this. Because there are fewer of you and more, if you like, places, more students are getting more than one offer to a medical school. So it is much more about you selecting the medical school as much as it is about them selecting you. You may always feel that it's the other way around, but in fact, increasingly, you have, or you may have, if you do things the correct way, you will have an opportunity to maybe choose which medical school you eventually end up in. And the increased choice is illustrated in this slide, where we now have more medical schools than we've ever had. Some are very new. I'm involved, for example, in the new one in Sunderland. And so therefore, you've got a choice of what you might regard as being ones that have been long established versus ones that are relatively new to the scene. And there are merits with both. And I would not want to be suggesting one thing or another, but I think it's up to you to decide. One thing I will say is that some of the newer medical schools have very specific targets in terms of who they're trying to recruit. So, you know, some of the new ones will have distinct outreach programs for people in a particular area. And that's very important if you happen to be in those areas, because you will more likely be selected by that medical school because of the fact that you're in their geographic location. So what do you want to think about when you're trying to select a medical school? Well, the first thing is you want to decide whether it's in a city or it's what's called a campus one, which sometimes is a bit remote from the city centre, but has a community atmosphere born of that remoteness. So I can think of two offhand. Lancaster I visited last year, and that's a campus university with a brand new medical school facility being built. And similarly, Brighton and Sussex Medical School is a campus environment, whereas the one I'm in at the moment, it's in Cardiff, it's a city and has the benefits of being in, at least in this situation, a capital city. It's also a big medical school. Some only recruit 50 students, some, like ourselves, recruit almost 300. So it's important to think about this when you're considering which ones to apply for. Similarly, distance. And I know that this is a big issue with the current issues to do with COVID about traveling to and from, and that links to the idea of, well, how easy can I get to this university medical school? For example, if you choose to go to Queen's in Belfast, you will undoubtedly have to fly or at least sail to get to that medical school. The other thing that you might be considering is the issue to do with the rankings that, you know, virtually all medical schools and indeed universities are being subjected to. And I would kind of dissuade you a little bit to be influenced too much by these. All medical schools have to teach to a GMC, the General Medical Council standard, and therefore they all have to reach a particular level of expertise in you as a student doctor before they can graduate you. So it doesn't really hugely matter about these rankings, and they are rather arbitrary, I would say. However, there is another element to this, and that is if you're thinking of doing research, then clearly it would be important. And you can do research in a variety of ways, whether it be part of your curriculum, studying and doing some research alongside it, or taking a year, as some medical schools allow, to do what's called an intercalated degree and do some research for a year. And of course, what you want to do is work with the best researchers you can find. So that may influence you. You may think about the type of course. Some are traditional, some are more modern in terms of their design, some are 6 years, some are 5 years. And these are things that you need to think about before perhaps deciding on your final 4 choices when you come to fill in the UCAS form later in the year or next year. Accommodation. Cardiff prides itself, for example, in being a relatively cheap city, but there are obviously towns and medical schools, if you like, in throughout the UK that are cheaper, and you want to think about the accommodation and indeed what type of accommodation is offered. Some universities offer all first-year students accommodation, guaranteed halls accommodation, others don't. Student union life is an important aspect of all student life within a university, so it's important to think about how good the university's student union is. The final point I would make is, have you got any mates or any connections with medical schools? Because often people learn about medical schools from hearing recommendations from whether it be family members, seniors within your school who have already gone to a medical school and made a decision and then tell you how good or otherwise that medical school is. And the final thing, and I appreciate this is not always an option, but I would always encourage any prospective medical student to go and visit the medical schools that they're thinking about. Because at the end of the day, it's all about how it feels. Is it friendly? Do they accommodate you when you ask for things, and are there students available to talk to you? And all sorts of issues like that can influence whether or not you find the particular medical school to your liking. As I've already alluded, the course length is variable. So it may be most what are called A100 courses last 5 years, but there are some med schools that build in an extra year. They have a compulsory 1-year intercalated program. Others, it's optional. And I saw already on the chat some of the questions about entry requirements, and I'll maybe discuss this a little bit later on. But, do you need good GCSEs? Well, yes, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to need a basic standard of GCSEs to be considered by any medical school. But some tariff them more heavily than others. Others use, and I think Rachel Gretrix from UCAT is going to be talking after me this morning. We'll be talking about the UCAT admissions test. And similarly, I think there's a speaker talking about the BMAT admissions test. So it's really important you understand which of these tests are going to be required for the particular medical schools that you're going to be applying to. Do you need work experience? And the thing that I would say first and foremost in the days of COVID, that we recognise, all medical schools have recognised that this is difficult in the current climate. And there is some advice, and I'll point you to this in a minute, about what you can and can expect in terms of work experience. And if you're successful in getting past the so-called entry requirements, the next consideration is, well, how do they interview me? Because all medical school students are selected via an interview. Some of these are panel interviews where it's you and maybe 2 or 3 other people. Others are what are called multiple mini interviews. And there are reasons why each of these 2 formats might suit you better than perhaps the other. And finally, how does the course feel? Does it feel like something that you would like to engage in? For example, some of them are traditional and they will allow you to study more science in the first years with very little clinical input, and then perhaps more clinical activity in the later years. Others have patient contact from very early on in the course. This brings me on to describe these different ones, and I don't want to labour the point too much because it's really up to you to go and investigate these different types of courses. I've taught on pretty much every sort of course listed here, and I think generally the feeling is these days that students benefit from doing PBL or CBL type approach, particularly if it links directly to patient contact whilst they're doing these cases or problem-based exercises. Most courses have some degree of integration. There are still only a few that do a very clear preclinical split and then a clinical thing. So the first 2 years generally is pretty heavily loaded with lectures, and if that's your learning style, then maybe that's the sort you want to explore. Very rarely do I say things that I say, this is probably the most important thing I'll say, but this is it. This is the source that I recommend all students go to inform themselves about the medical schools that they're considering. As you can see, the Medical Schools Council, which acts on behalf of all medical schools, compiles this document. It's in form of a PDF or a searchable online, and it gives you the opportunity to look in detail at some of the things I've just described. So I'd encourage you all to go and look at the information at the Medical Schools Council. There are a lot of resources there, and there are reasons why I recommend this. It's really because it's accurate. People like me fill the forms in. Most importantly, it's free, so it allows everybody equal opportunity to get access to the information, and it's endorsed by all the UK medical schools. So there's very good reasons why you would want to use the medical school sources. And just on the right of the slide, I've picked out a resource that is extremely useful. This was put together some years ago and is so-called a Journey to Medicine. Ostensibly, it's for teachers, but in fact, if you go and look at them as a prospective medical student, you will find there are exercises in there and information in these brochures that will guide you in the journey to medicine. And I would thoroughly encourage you to go and have a look at these sources. So what are the medical schools looking for? Well, it's always a bit of a debate as to how much of the braininess we want and how much is about personality. But I think you'd probably agree that most people would want their doctor to have some ability in terms of brain power to be able to make the diagnosis and have the knowledge to be able to accurately determine what may be wrong with you. But it's important also to recognize that the personality of that individual needs to be considered. And often what medical schools do is they combine the assessment of these two. So for example, UCAT score would be one way of measuring cognitive ability, and then the interview and personal statement and other devices are used to judge what are called the non-cognitive abilities. Your abilities, for example, to get on with people, to work well as a team, what your moral compass is like, whether you're generally a fair person, whether you're a good timekeeper, all those kind of skills that make up a person's personality. So it's important you remember that it's not just about performance and exams, it's also about the other elements that will make you a doctor that has skills beyond just the diagnostic skills. There are a number of routes into medicine, and I think it's important you realize this. Often students think if they don't get in through after GCSEs or an admissions test, then that's the end. Well, you can still get into medical school either applying after you've done your A-levels, and in this current climate, universities tend to like students who have got their A-levels in their back pocket and apply having done that. And even if that doesn't work, you can still apply with a degree, and that's called a graduate entry medical program. These are usually 4-year degree programs. There are also so-called 5-year graduate entry programs. So it's important that you look at the whole range of opportunities, that not one of them precludes you from applying, if you like, to the next. So I mentioned the non-cognitive skills and the things that we look for, and they're the things that you'd expect. The candidates that we're looking at, people focused, and how do you represent that? Well, there's a list there and I won't want to rehearse them. Are they caring? have they shown responsibility within the family? Do they look after their neighbours or elderly grandparents? Have they got do they know what it's like to deal with the public? Do they have jobs that lead them to interact with members of the public and learn how that's done? And have they had responsibilities at school and college? And it's important to think about what you've given back, if you like, in your in your college or your school, in terms of societies and other ways of being responsible. And that could extend to things like captaincy of sports teams. A lot is said these days about keeping what's called a reflective log. And you can read a lot about reflective practice, but generally it falls into the what, so what, and now what kind of three categories. So what happened? Well, what did you think when that happened? And how would you do it differently if it happened again, is essentially what people are asking you to think about in these so-called reflective logs. And the most important thing is to express what you've learned about yourself. I can't tell you how many things I've read over the years that have narrated detailed surgical procedures that a student may have seen and a work experience. But we're not interested in that. We want to know what that student felt when they heard the hip being disarticulated during the hip replacement, because there's no noise on this planet that is similar to that when the hip is being distracted out of its joint. Do you see what I'm saying? It's important to realize that it's about what you learn about yourself. What I'm going to say now is probably a little controversial, because I'm sure many of you, if you haven't started, you're all thinking or perhaps thinking about your personal statements. And one of the things I would do first off is use that resource that I mentioned from the Medical Schools Council and look to see how personal statements are used. And I can tell you categorically that there are a number of medical schools that just don't look at them at all. Some use them to a slight degree, some to a greater degree. And the reason that I'm very cautious about advising people to spend, weeks and months burnishing a personal statement, partly because of what I've just said, but also the fact that in my experience, they tend to be formulaic. They can't be verified. You don't know how accurate or otherwise what's being told you is. And the real question these days is who wrote it? Because we are aware as medical schools that there is commercial firms offering the opportunity, if not to write it for you, but if not, then to give you a lot of considerable amount of help in constructing it. So I think you've got to be cautious about over-egging the personal statement. I always say to people who ask me, the most important thing about a personal statement is the word personal. Make it yours. Make it sound like it's you, because that's the only advice I ever offer in terms of personal statement. I mentioned earlier about work experience, and again, I would encourage you to go and have a look at this document, which was published by the MSc in consultation with all the medical schools when COVID first struck, because it was clear that there would be problems for students trying to get relevant work experience or any experience at the time of COVID. And there's some great resources embedded in this document, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at it. You don't necessarily have to go and see a patient in a doctor's surgery. There is some online resource there that may guide you as to understand what experience that might be like. So if we then talk about very briefly the process is pretty straightforward every year, and this year is no exception. There will be an application round, and you have to meet the 15th of October deadline that is set by UCAS. We then see whether or not you've met our criteria. On the basis of that, we decide whether we're going to offer you an interview. You then go off and do some interview preparation. Interviews are usually held, and it's pretty flexible, sometime in the December, January. That's the case for us, but it's variable depending on other medical schools. And then on the basis of that interview, you're then offered a place or not. You're provided often with interview feedback, but this can be a little bit generic and not always easy to pick the bones out of and understand. And then you have a choice. You can either think about the other routes that I mentioned earlier, or indeed some medical schools may, like ourselves, if you failed at the interview stage, then we will allow you to reapply and we will reconsider you the following year. So that's the cycle, the usual cycle of application. The interviews themselves are generally an opportunity for the medical schools to judge your non-cognitive skills. So it's important that you understand what type of interview is going to be used by the medical school that you're going to be visiting. Learn about the medical school, learn about the university in which it's embedded and the learning style that the course is offering. Be self-reflective in the way that I described a few minutes ago and think about your skills, abilities and interests. I can tell you absolutely categorically, I'm useless at timekeeping, but my real skill set is acting as a glue in a team. I'm the person that glues a team together. Not a great leader, not a great timekeeper, but I can certainly get a team to work with me. That goes to the point next. Be confident and positive. Be assured of what you are good at and be positive about it. Don't undersell yourself. Answer the question that you're asked. So avoid giving rehearsed answers, because sometimes these don't exactly match the question that was asked. And as much as possible, stay calm and follow instructions, because some schools use the ability to follow those instructions as an assessment of your abilities. Most of the medical schools these days use multiple mini interviews, and I think there are sessions today at this conference that will allow you to have a bit of an understanding of how you do these. But the most important thing is that I think when I last counted, about 2/3 of medical schools now use MMIs, this format. And what it is it's been likened to speed dating. I've never done speed dating, so I have no idea whether that's true or not. But what it is an opportunity to be assessed by a number of different people. And what it means is that performance at one station that doesn't hit the mark doesn't mean the whole interview has been put at peril. It means you can pick yourself up and do the next one and hopefully do better at that one and then perhaps still be selected. And that's certainly true from my experience, that students that have done poorly in one or two stations still manage to get selected at the end. And finally, you may think this is hard, but it's about resilience, because picking yourself up and going again is really what resilience is all about. But it also mirrors a lot of what are called the clinical assessments that are provided on courses. So these are called observed structured clinical examinations. And so therefore they are, in a sense, a prelude to what comes when you're assessed in the course itself. These are the sorts of areas that we look at when we're, and I wouldn't say that these are generic, but they're pretty much what most medical schools look at. And when you look at it, these are the ones we use in Cardiff, and therefore C21 is our Cardiff curriculum. So if you substitute in there the word curriculum of the medical school that you're looking at, that would be what you might expect to be asked about. Self-directedness, well, you can make that manifest a number of ways, but often these days people do the extended project, the EPQ, and you can maybe talk about how you researched your EPQ. Often there's questions about the NHS. We pride the NHS, we are grateful for the NHS and what they've been doing, particularly over the recent months. So it's important you understand the NHS. You understand what a career in medicine is like, that you have the right ethical and moral compass, that you're empathetic, that you have some degree of resilience, that you can work in a team, and so on. So these are the kind of domains that you'll be quizzed on when you do the multiple mini interviews. Now that is bringing me pretty much to the end of all that I've got to say. I'm sorry this has been a bit Cardiff centric, but unfortunately that's the most recent medical school that I can reference, and it's the one for which I'm responsible for medical entry into. But what we're trying to do, and what I'm trying to do, is encourage as many of you to consider medicine as a potential career. And this is why I'm keen to support Raj, Sunny and his colleagues that run these courses and these conferences, because it is all about getting representation from all dimensions of society into medical schools so that they can best serve the population that they come from. Okay, it just remains for me to say thanks for your attention, and in due course, I hope you're successful when you think about applying to medical school.